Hi, thank you for joining the presentation today. My name is Tani Aitken and I'm one of the Kindergarten Inclusion Support Consultants with Uniting. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about sensory processing. So we'll discuss the understanding of sensory processing, what you might see in a child who's having sensory processing challenges, some general strategies you can use with the children, and how stress plays an important role in a child's ability to manage the sensory overload or the sensory seeking that they're trying to obtain. What I would like for you to think as we're going through the workshop today is about a key takeaway, something that you think that you could use in your practice. Okay, so let's talk first about what is sensory processing. Sensory processing is the organising and interpreting of the information received by the senses, and this is done in the brain. We know that sensory processing is not a choice, it's a reaction. So it's not a choice that the child is making to respond in a certain way to sensory information or sensory overload or sensory seeking. It's a reaction, it's their reaction to sensory information, and it is not something that is in their control. We know with sensory processing that everyone is different, so how particular individuals respond to sensory information will be very individual. We know that safety is really of importance with a child who has a sensory processing disorder or who has sensory processing challenges, because they may be engaging in activities to help regulate their sensory system that might put them in a position of danger. And we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail. A really good analogy to understand sensory processing in children or in an individual with a sensory processing disorder is how you might feel when you put your hand on a hot stove. It's so overwhelming, the experience is so intense that you would quickly remove your hand from the stove. This is how a child could feel who has an itchy jumper on their skin. The feeling of the fabric on their skin could be so overwhelming that above all, they need to get that jumper off, and they will do anything they can to get that jumper off their skin. It might be the same feeling for water on their hands. It might be the same feeling for socks on their feet. It might be the same feeling from a tag in the back of their pants. So it's just something to be mindful of. What we need to do is we need to understand the individual and their sensory processing system, and then we can make adjustments to the environment and to the activities. Okay, so what are the senses? Well, we've got our 5 senses that we all know about: the touch, the skin in and around the mouth. Sight is what we see, and that sense of sight is what helps to organise and interpret and put together all of the other senses. Sound, which is the outer and the middle ear. Smell, which is also called the olfactory sense, and this is the information received by the nose. It's linked very closely with the taste, which is also called the gustatory, and that's the skin in and around the mouth. But we do also have 2 other senses that we talk about when we talk about sensory processing. The first one is called proprioception. This is the position of our body, how and where we move in space. And the vestibular sense. This is our balance and how fast or slow our body is moving. Okay, so let's talk a bit about proprioception first. This is the information about where our body is in space and what it is doing. So this information comes from the muscles and the joints, and it gives us information about the position of our body, how we move, and where we are moving in space. The other sense is the vestibular sense or the movement sense. So this is information about balance and about how fast or slow our body is moving in response to movement. It comes from the inner ear, so it's linked closely with that, and the position of our heads and bodies in space. Okay, so when we talk about sensory processing, we talk about children who are oversensitive, and we also talk about children who are undersensitive. So oversensitivity, or in other words, avoiding. This is where too much information is received by the nervous system and the child will try and get away from the sense or avoid it. Undersensitivity is also called sensory seeking, and this is where the nervous system needs more information than normal to register sensations, and they will be seeking out that sensory input that they need to feel regulated. Children may have varying degrees and may fluctuate from morning to afternoon, from hour to hour, and from day to day. Okay, so let's have a look first at what oversensitivity is. So if we remember that oversensitive means too much information, and we are going to avoid the sensory input. So touch. An example here is that some children with sensory processing oversensitivity to touch might be okay with a deep touch or that firm touch, but may not like light touch, and this is seen fairly commonly in children. They may have an oversensitivity to hearing, so therefore they may like to cover their ears, they may like to make sounds to block. It's when there's too much information coming in through an auditory perspective through their hearing. An oversensitivity to vision may be those children who you'll see that will hide away or will look for a dark corner, or may like to put their eyes down, or potentially sometimes look out of the corner of their eyes, because if they're looking straight out of their eyes, it's too much visual information to process, so they may find it easier for them to look out the side of their eyes. Gustatory, this is also taste. So these are the children who you might see who might be quite picky eaters. So they're a bit oversensitive to the tastes in their mouth. So they may only like certain foods or tastes or textures. The olfactory linked very closely with the gustatory. So that's the smell. The olfactory is the smell. So this also can relate to children having challenges with eating a variety of food and only liking certain foods. But the olfactory sense of the oversensitivity to smell can often be overlooked, and we may not realise that it is actually this sensation that's causing some distress or frustration or difficulty for the child. So being mindful with your smell sensation of your perfume and the shampoos you use and the cleaning products that you use in the kindergarten, or the smells at the table of other children's lunches, it can be overwhelming for some children. So these are two extra sensory processing areas of proprioception. A child who is oversensitive may appear a bit clumsy or stiff or often bump into things. And a child who has an oversensitivity to the movement may not like some kinds of movement, may have a fear of it, may not like their feet off the floor, may not like to go on the swing or be in an upside down position such as yoga or somersaults, those kind of activities. Okay, so what can we do for a child who has got some oversensitivity? So we need to be really mindful of the environment and the environmental impact in all of those areas of the senses. But an area of common oversensitivity is noise. And the kindergarten environment can be a very noisy environment, both indoors and outdoors. So it may contribute to children's behaviours of concern or difficulty regulating their emotions because they're getting too much auditory information. So a simple strategy could be to introduce some headphones as an option for children to use during the kindergarten day. They could be noise blocking headphones, or they could be a listening station where they could listen to some music. If we do introduce something like headphones, it is advisable to have a number of sets. So the children who, even if they don't have a sensory processing disorder, there might be other children who would like to use the headphones as well. And we can introduce them in a simple way with a social story about why we have headphones and how they can help. Okay, so let's have a little look at the undersensitivity. And this is where children are sensory seekers and are trying to get more sensory input to make them feel calm and regulated. So a child who's undersensitive to touch. This is the child that you might see touching lots of things. They could be unaware of pain and temperature, so therefore the safety can be of concern for these children who may not seem to be aware so much of the pain and the temperature. Hearing. These children might appear to ignore others. It may be that they have not heard the sound or they've not registered the sound, so it appears as though they're ignoring others. They also could be a child who makes a lot of noise or makes their own noise to block out other noises, but also to make their own noise to give themselves noise input if they're wanting more. They may like loud music, or they may only like certain types of music, and they may also speak in a louder voice. The child who's undersensitive in the area of vision may look at objects for a long time. This child may also look out of the side of their eyes because they're trying to get more information by looking at an object in a different way. They might bump into others as they may not have seen or been aware of other things in their environment. And they may also engage in activities such as flapping and spinning, flapping their hands in front of their face, spinning around in circles, picking up things like sand and watching the sand fall in front of their eyes. Some of these activities may be a self-regulation type activity as well. The flapping and spinning can be for children who are feeling anxious, and it can be a regulating, calming activity, but it also can be a visual sensory input activity. So the gustatory, which is the taste. These are the child who you might see who's eating non-food objects. So they might be picking up the toys in the environment and putting them in their mouth. They might be chewing on a lot of different things, and they might be chewing on their clothing. So I'll talk about a couple of strategies that we can try for these children. Olfactory is the smell. So these children may also eat non-food objects to get that information through their nose as well. The smell and smell, seek out smelling different objects. A child who is undersensitive to the proprioceptive input, which is the deep pressure and the feedback through their muscles and their joints. These children like to crash into things, or they might bump into others. They might sit next to you on the mat and really lean into you or lean onto other things. And these are the children who like that deep pressure input. The children who are undersensitive to vestibular, you might see that they have a challenge in sitting still. They might run up and down in the classroom inside, climb on the tables, they might spin around a lot, they might like the activity of going on the swings or the climbing frames outside. Now again, these are just some examples, and every child is different, so what it looks like in one child may be very different to another. Okay, so this is an example of an oral motor tool that you can use for a child who is undersensitive to gustatory or taste and that olfactory smell input. So a chewy tube can be used as a replacement activity. So what we want to do is, if we've got children who are seeking out sensory input, but they're engaging in activities that are a danger to themselves or to others, or they're not very socially appropriate, and we want to try and teach them another activity that they could do instead as a replacement. We need to remember that the replacement activity that we teach them needs to be easier or just as easy as the activity that they're currently doing, or that otherwise they won't use it as a replacement behaviour. So this chewy tube can be worn as a necklace, or it can be a tool that's used and picked up. But the chewy tube can be put around a child's neck. It's a safe occupational therapy tool that can be purchased if you purchase it through the correct pathways. And this can be used and given to a child every time they try to put a non-food object in their mouth that could be dangerous. You replace it by offering or prompting the child to put the chewy tube in their mouth instead. Okay, so for a child who's seeking out that proprioceptive input, that's the feedback through their muscles and their joints. This is the child who might engage in dangerous activities, or activities that aren't that socially appropriate, such as bumping into others or running into the wall or crashing onto the ground quite a lot. So these are the activities that you could teach the child to be able to do, or you could do them with the child to help give them that feedback through their muscles and their joints. And this is just one example of some occupational therapy designed proprioception activities that you could use as a replacement activity to give the child the input they're seeking out in a socially appropriate way. When we're looking at children who have got vestibular seeking proprioceptive, vestibular seeking sensory needs, we might look at some props that we can put in place that can help the child engage in their movement, but then also be able to participate in a group activity or mealtime or sitting down with other children. So you've got TheraBands that you can put around the legs of the chair so children can continue to move their legs while sitting. You've got wobbly cushions or wobbly chairs or balls that they can sit on so they can still move but sit down at the same time. And then you can also offer supported backs. So if you've got group time where all of the children are sitting on the floor, some children with sensory processing disorder prefer to have a back. So you might choose a floor cushion with a back on it, or you may offer a chair for them to sit on, and you might find that they sit better with a back to the floor cushion or a chair with a back on it. Okay, now let's go through a couple of the considerations for the kindergarten classroom and environment. We'll talk through each of these areas one by one. Okay, so indoors and the indoor environment. You need to consider the visual clutter and reducing the number of visual stimuli in the classroom that may be overwhelming for children. You may consider modifying the lighting or having time where the lighting's off and there's more natural lighting. You may consider using the whole room rather than having all of the children in half the room or a quarter of the room, using the space of the whole kindergarten classroom. You may consider providing a quiet space, and it may not be the quiet space that you allocate. It needs to be where the child prefers and what quiet space they seek out. So you might set up a quiet corner and it may not be where the child wants to go. So you really need to understand the child's needs and what's going to work for them. Headphones, as I mentioned before, can be a great option to block or reduce noise. An indoor-outdoor program is a really simple way to allow the children to self-regulate and to be able to choose the environment or the area that suits their sensory needs best. Movement breaks, which I'll discuss a little bit more about. Consider the smells in the environment and the smells that you have on yourself when you come into the kindergarten, the classroom, such as perfume, and then also the smells that there are around in the kindergarten environment. Large body movement activities would also be something to consider as an option for the indoors, especially if you're not running an indoor-outdoor environment. So you've got an area in the indoor classroom that's safe, that the child can engage in some jumping, maybe on a small trampoline, or maybe some throwing activities, beanbag throwing, or it might be some proprioceptive big body breaks that you might implement with the children. And moving before sitting, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in detail as well. Okay, so when we're in the outdoor environment, this is often the preferred environment for children. So when you're outdoors, you might like to set up specific obstacle courses that can give some children some proprioceptive input that they're seeking. You might set up some heavy work things outside, such as safely carrying around bricks or rocks or stones in the garden, digging activities, using wheelbarrows, little wheelbarrow walk races or activities with friends, things where they can really get their body into it and get that feedback through their muscles and their joints. Consider the feet on the floor. So for those children who really don't like their feet on the floor, consider the activities you're offering and never force the children to engage in those kinds of activities. And also the same with those children, those who don't like being upside down. And remembering it's often the more calming environment, so it may be the area that you find that the children who have sensory processing disorder are more calm and relaxed. Okay, group time. There are a number of things to consider with group time, and it's not just sensory, but there are some things that are sensory based that you may like to consider for group time. If you are going to sit down for a group time or meal time, you might want to ensure that the child is engaged in some movement activities first. And this is particularly for those vestibular movement seeking children who are moving around the classroom a lot. It can be challenging for them to sit at all. So if they've engaged in some movement activities prior to sitting, it can help their success in being able to sit down. And you can also use those tools as mentioned, some mat squares, so they've got a clearly defined space which reduces the light touch of others, chairs with TheraBands around them. You could have fidget toys, and then you could have some other sensory inputs such as weighted lap cushions or shoulder cushions, the wobble sit cushions, those kind of things. And then I would just encourage you to consider, is the activity that is being done in the group time, is it of interest to the child? Is it multi-sensory? Does it involve movement? Have they got sensory props that they're using? These are the kind of the things that may engage some of those children with sensory processing challenges a little bit more in the group time activities. Okay, so when we talk about movement breaks, It's important that these children who are vestibular seeking get enough movement input in a socially appropriate way that's scheduled into the day. So you've got children coming to kindergarten in the morning straight from home. Some of these children haven't had any opportunity to engage in large body activities. So it might be worthwhile to think about what movement activities are set up for the children first thing in the day when they arrive. Often children come straight in and it's inside time, and it may be challenging for some children if they have not had a movement break first. Before mat and lunchtime, when they're required to sit down, the movement breaks can be helpful. When you're indoors, as I mentioned, having some movement activities available in the classroom. It can help children calm and organise, and it can act as a preventative break to prevent that build-up of sensory seeking and emotional regulation. So sensory calming activities is another idea to schedule into the day. These are activities that calm and regulate the child. So it's very individual what's calming for one child to another, but it could be playing with a toy of interest. It could be having the headphones to quieten the noise. It could be doing the stereotypical activities such as so it's worthwhile to look at the individual and work out what is calming for them and schedule these in throughout the day. Okay, so here are some examples of activities that might be calming. The lycra is a proprioceptive activity that you can use with the children, where you've got a stretchy piece of lycra and the children are wrapped safely in it with their heads out, and then they've got the opportunity to push against the fabric and get some feedback through their muscles and their joints. You could do the wheelbarrows outside and do some heavy work for those children who like proprioceptive. And then you've got other activities such as visual stimuli or visual input or visual toys, where they're getting some visual input for those who do seek out that visual input that can help calm and relax them. Okay, transitions can be challenging for a number of reasons outside of just sensory, but some of the sensory impacts of a transition are that there is a lot of touch and a lot of noise when children are lining up. So you might consider where the child is placed when they are lining up for a transition. And it could be at the beginning or the end of the line that reduces the amount of sensory touch that they're receiving, but also the noise and the visual and all of the busyness of the line. So the beginning or the end often works better for those children who have sensory processing challenges. As I mentioned before, a quiet space is something that's really helpful to think about for the kindergarten classroom. And it may not be the same area that the child goes to every day, but it's just somewhere that's away from the rest of the group or the noise or the vision or anything that's overwhelming for the child. And it's giving them a place to calm. And they may just require some props to reduce that sensory input or some props to change the sensory input, for example, listening to music. Mealtimes again can be challenging. Some children like to move, so if you can offer some movement before the mealtime or the TheraBand around the chair or wobbly cushions to help them sit through the mealtime. But also proximity to others can be challenging for some children, so they may be better off sitting at a table near the other children with only one other child with them, or if they sit on a mat outside, maybe they're better off at a separate mat with one other child or two other children, because sometimes the other children close by can be a little bit overwhelming from a sensory perspective. There are also the other considerations such as the food and the textures of the food for those children who have an oversensitivity to food and to taste and to smell, and then also the smells from other children's food that might be overwhelming for some children. Okay, as I mentioned at the beginning, stress plays a big part of sensory processing. So when a child is oversensitive to certain sensory input, this can overstimulate the senses and can cause stress. Anxiety can also be caused by unpredictable or distressing sensory input. In reverse, in times of stress, the nervous system is already stimulated, so a person can become even more sensitive to information through their senses, which can then add further to their stress levels. Undersensitivity to sensory information can also contribute to stress. So those individuals who might be undersensitive to sounds, they might become stressed through missing the subtle sensory information that provides warning of a stimuli or of something approaching. For example, a child who doesn't hear the teacher approaching and calling their name, and then all of a sudden the teacher is right next to them and standing upon them. It can become very overwhelming and it can become frightening for some children. So just be really aware of your movements and your actions for some of those children who might be undersensitive or showing that they might have some undersensitivity to sound. Okay, so with all of this information about sensory processing, where do we start? First of all, we need to take some observations. They can be really simple, such as an ABC chart. That's antecedent, what happens before, the behaviour, what actually is happening, and then the consequence, which is what actually happens after. Some really simple observations of what you're seeing with their sensory processing, how they're responding to certain sensory input, or any behaviours of concern can be really helpful in helping you determine your starting point and what activities you are going to put in place to support the child. Once you've got these observations and you decide on some strategies that you're going to put in place to help give children the sensory input that they need, or to provide replacement sensory activities for socially inappropriate sensory seeking behaviours, or strategies you're going to put in place to reduce sensory input, it's advisable to put this in a behaviour support plan. This is where you'll put all of your proactive strategies to support the child. It is recommended if the child has an occupational therapist that they are involved in this as well, because an occupational therapist is the best therapist to support children with sensory processing challenges. And the families will be part of this behaviour support plan. It gets their buy-in and their agreement to the strategies that are being used. Once you've got a behaviour support plan in place and some strategies, then you've got the chance to be able to review these strategies after you've implemented them and see what's working and what's not working. It is also important to remember that strategies can wear out. So you might have a strategy that works for a little while and then it doesn't work anymore.